We now turn to our senior national and environmental correspondent, Ben Tracy. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So, Ben, we hear Florida's Governor DeSantis say things like this is a 500-year flood event. They've never experienced anything like this. What's making the storm hit differently?
Well, I think we have to look at this in the context of climate change. And we should say, first off, that climate change doesn't cause a hurricane to happen. But scientists increasingly believe that climate change is making hurricanes stronger and more destructive. And the reason for that is pretty simple. It's that the ocean waters are much warmer than they used to be, and warm ocean water is rocket fuel for a hurricane. So when one of these storms passes over this warm water, it just turbocharges this thing, and it's what they call rapid intensification. And we're seeing this more often. They actually believe since 2017, we've had about 30 storms that have rapidly intensified right before they hit the coast. And that's a huge issue for people in these coastal communities because they don't have as much time to prepare for that. And in addition to all of that, climate change is making the atmosphere warmer, and that means there's more water. So there's more rain when these storms hit, and that leads to flooding.
So taxpayers just invested this historic amount of money in trying to control climate change. That's what President Biden sold it as, and Democrats supported. You also have FEMA sending a record $3.5 billion to states to help lessen disaster impact. Is this record investment going where the scientists say it needs to go?
Well, the scientists would say that any money that is spent to more quickly wean us off of fossil fuels, to transition us to renewable forms of energy, is where the money is best spent. Of course, if you're the government, you also know that you have to deal with disasters when they happen and the impacts those are having on people and property. So they're trying to do both things here. But you talk about the historic investment. I mean, this is about $370 billion for climate initiatives. But a very small amount of that, only about $4 billion to $5 billion, is going for what they call climate resilience. So this would go to help some of these coastal communities rebuild wetlands, build seawalls, the kinds of things that you need for protection. But scientists will say, as long as we keep burning fossil fuels, we're just digging a hole and we're making that hole bigger. So that's where the money needs to be spent. That's why you hear a lot about some of the renewable energy provisions of this, the electric car credits, the things that we can do in our own homes to stop using fossil fuels.
And that's an important part of this story. But again, immediate versus long term.
Exactly. And you're going to see projects all over this country where they're building massive infrastructure projects to try to defend the coast. But the one thing most people never want to talk about is a phenomenon called managed retreat. And this is not something Americans like to hear, but it's this issue of, should we be rebuilding in these areas that are prone to get hit over and over again? And at what point does that just become financially irresponsible if you can't get insurance in these areas? So you then have people who lose their homes, their businesses, and they're just left flat broke.
And that's a question for any governor in one of these coastal communities. Ben, great context. Thank you very much for joining us. And we'll be right back with a lot more Face the Nation. Stay with us. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're joined now by the former director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Chris Krebs. Good morning. Good to have you here in person.
Morning.
I want to ask you first about hurricane response, because you were involved back in 2017 with the response to Hurricane Maria, which just devastated Puerto Rico. What are the biggest challenges you see right now, both for that island and for this devastation in Florida?
Well, I think the first issue is the devastation, as you mentioned. What structures, what communities can actually take power? I think in general, and speaking with the power restoration task forces, they've done a good job of marshaling resources, getting linemen and crews down into the areas that can actually be restored. But as you heard from the mayor and the administrator, there are areas that simply just cannot take power right now, and it's going to take time to evaluate, see if they're condemned or otherwise. And so, but again, the power teams have done a good job in Florida, and they've actually, I think, done a good job in Puerto Rico as well after Fiona. When you're looking at, 10 days after Fiona, 90% of the power is restored. In Maria, that took about 7 months.
And they're still, in many ways, on the recovery track from Maria.
Yeah, I think over the last few years, they have done a better job of management, of investment, and of maintenance. But now they're at a position where I think they have to think about upgrading the system. They're still a fairly antiquated, older system, and they do have to kind of move forward with that.
I want to ask you about infrastructure beyond hurricane, of course. We are, 36 days from the midterms? You have large displacement now of people in Florida. Is that going to have an impact on the ability to carry out elections?
There are plans in place, and we heard the senator talk about Hurricane Michael from 2018, which Mexico Beach was devastated. There are rules and systems in place that allow for some flexibility in how the elections are conducted, and they will ensure that those that want to vote can vote. If I've seen anything, it's election officials are natural crisis managers and really good at the resilience side of it.
Well, they have to be right now, given all the pressures on them. Switching to the cyber front. So you were in office during the midterms in 2018, and Cyber Command was pretty explicit that they went on the offense to protect our midterm races at that time, taking out Russian operatives to deter spreading disinformation. Right. We know they're watching what's happening this year. What does that look like? What does protecting our election against foreign interference look like?
Well, as I look at the concerns around the 2022 midterm elections, I have three primary areas of focus. First is the continued domestic efforts to undermine the process, attack workers. The second is this increase in insider risk. And as that all kind of manifests in political instability here domestically, it gives a lot of opportunity and attack surface for the bad guys. We've seen over the last couple of years, the foreign actors, that is, we've seen the Iranians, we've seen the Russians, and even recently we've seen the Chinese start to take some of the Russian plans, and it's almost Russification of Chinese information operations. So what I would look at is more, plagiarizing domestic issues and driving wedges into the discourse here in the U.S. Probably not manufacturing new narratives or anything like that, but instead really hitting on the issues that we're already talking about here and just making them that much more heated.
Meta took down a small Chinese network trying to influence elections. This is the Facebook sphere. Right. Is that the prime platform for disinformation?
Well, I think they're using a number of different techniques, and that's the Chinese. Again, it's still fairly rudimentary and remedial in terms of the Chinese influence operations. Once they get a little bit more sophisticated, I think that's where they're probably going to have a greater impact. But it's not just online. It's not just the social media platforms. They're actually working at the local levels to support individual candidates. And this is some reporting, I think, that may come out in the near future, but it's the Chinese have been very, very active at a local corruption level, where the Russians are more focused at the top on, the more disrupting the election process. A good friend in the intelligence community has said, Russia is the hurricane, China is climate change in the sense of political interference.
The sort of slow creeping coming up on you. I just want to come back. You said insider risk to U.S. elections. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's actually, we're seeing actual election workers that have been swept up in the continued efforts to delegitimize the 2020 election. And now they're on the inside. They're posing a risk. We've seen in Mesa County, Colorado, Coffee County, Georgia, Antrim County, Michigan, where workers have allowed access by unauthorized people into the system and access to equipment. And even just the other day in the primaries, we saw that there was a worker that plugged a USB drive into a machine, and now those systems have been rendered or taken out of service. So we actually, rather than just the foreign interference threats that I think we really had to think about in 18 and 20, now we have actual insiders. We have election workers that are posing a risk to the process itself.
Well, that's terrifying. Why? So part of the balance for anyone who was in a role like you had, how much do you publicize? How much do you draw attention? And at what point does that undermine confidence rather than raise confidence in integrity? That's
the challenge.
Is the administration doing enough on what you just laid out?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think that there are a lot of tools right now available to counter both threats to election workers, and we continue to see death threats and under intimidation means against election workers, but then election workers themselves that have been, again, swept up into the process. So the tools aren't necessarily there. We do need local law enforcement, I think, to get more involved in investigating threats, protecting election workers themselves, ensuring that they're not being doxxed or their public information or their personal contact information is being released so they get more threats. So this is an area that I think Congress needs to take a hard look at. are the right deterrence measures in place from criminal statutes? And then do we have the investigation techniques? It is, I personally have received a significant number of death threats and other threats, and some of them come in through anonymous, through anonymous means like proton mail. We do need more attention on these threats.
Yes.
Otherwise, we're going to see a shortage of election workers.
That is quite a warning. Chris, thank you for joining us. We're going to continue to track that story and turn to yet another crisis right now, which is the Trump administration National Security Advisor in 2017, retired Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, who joins us. H.R., thank you for updating us on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine with the Russian invasion. I want to get your reaction to what Defense Secretary Austin called a significant development on the battlefield in the past 48 hours. What do you see happening, and what do you forecast as Vladimir Putin's next move?
Hey, good morning, Margaret. It's great to be with you. Well, this is a tremendous victory for the Ukrainians, and it's a victory that I think that they could turn into a cascading series of defeats of Russian forces. This is the encirclement of Lyman and the Russian forces pulling back, but also in the last 2 days, the Ukrainians also simultaneously defeated a Russian counterattack and also made progress further in the south near the strategically important city of Kherson. And I think, Margaret, what we might be at here is really at the precipice of really the collapse of the Russian army in Ukraine, a moral collapse. And I think they must really be at a breaking point if you look at just the numbers of casualties, the vast area that they're trying to defend. And now, of course, Russia is trying to mobilize conscripts and send them to the front untrained. And I think it's very important to also understand that these forces that are in full retreat now out of Lyman were really the first round of mobilization. Remember when Putin was trying to recruit more and more people with paying about 3 times the average wages to get so-called volunteers to go forward? Those forces were hastily trained, thrown into that front, and these are the forces that are collapsing just right now.
Well, and as that happens on the battlefield, rhetorically, you hear President Putin raise the volume, again, dangling that nuclear threat on Friday. And there was another Russian leader who talked about using low-yield nuclear weapons. It's not clear what NATO or the U.S. response would be if Russia used a nuclear tactical weapon on the battlefield in Ukraine. What do you think it should be?
Well, I think the message to him is if you use a nuclear weapon, it's a suicide weapon. And the response from NATO and the United States doesn't have to be nuclear. First of all, I would say, Margaret, he's under extreme pressure. I mean, you have the failures on the battlefield, which we talked about, but also the mobilization's failing. I mean, what he's done is he's mobilized almost 300,000 people to leave the country. These are men who are fleeing to neighboring countries to escape this conscription. And you have the Russian people now saying, okay, I thought this was a special military operation that Putin said, hey, just leave this to me. Don't worry about it. Now he's going to them to bail him out. With this mobilization, and what you're seeing, among the hyper-nationalist group of bloggers and even on state media is a blaming of the military. And what the military is going back to Putin and saying, hey, it's not our fault, we just need more troops. So it's this cycle that he's responding to with the only quiver he has left, which is to threaten the use of a nuclear weapon. Well, but I'll tell you, Margaret, I don't think a nuclear weapon is usable there. So I think that we ought to take it seriously. We have to. But we ought to not allow this to cow us in terms of the support for the Ukrainians.
Right. Well, the other weapon he has is energy, of course, and tracking this potential sabotage on the gas pipeline. I want to also ask you about when you were in office back in 2017, which was the first time that the U.S. gave offensive weapons to Ukraine. I remember when you were put in that position of having to explain a conversation then President Trump had with Russian officials in the Oval Office where he mentioned classified information. And you called it wholly appropriate at the time. Given what's going on now, this investigation into the classified material at Mar-a-Lago, were you ever uncomfortable with the former president's handling of classified information?
Well, Maura, remember, I left in February, March of 2018, but while I was there, I did not see any problems in handling of classified information. And what you're talking about really is a session in which the president did not disclose classified information, but somebody leaked it, and then it was published in a newspaper. So the classified information. I think what is important is to go back to that period, and that provision of javelins, of the defensive capabilities to the Ukrainians, was really important. And the argument I made to President Trump at the time was, hey, these people are telling you that it's provocative to provide Ukraine with defensive capabilities. Actually, what provokes Putin is weakness. And he was persuaded by that argument. And I think that argument is still relevant today. I mean, as Putin is encountering these difficulties, I think it's now time to remove some of the restrictions that we've put on ourselves in terms of the support to give the Ukrainians. And I'm talking about really long-range surveillance capabilities tied to long-range precision strike. And that's really what they need, I think, to maintain the momentum militarily at this stage.
I have a follow-up question on that, but just to button up the question I asked you, that was a no. You were never uncomfortable with the handling of classified information? Okay.
No, Margaret, there were systems in place. I don't know what happened to those systems, but I was never uncomfortable with it while I was there. But, that was a long time ago now.
Okay. I know when you're in office, you never like answering counterfactuals, but you're not in office. So was Vladimir Putin so committed to this invasion that he would have gone through with it no matter what?
I don't think so. Think about all the support that we've given now to the Ukrainians. What if we had done that a few years ago? I think Putin may have come to the conclusion, well, Ukraine cannot be subsumed at an acceptable cost. And of course, he was wrong in all the assumptions that led to the invasion, and he's been proven wrong by courageous Ukrainians who are defending their sovereignty. But I think deterrence by denial for us was a failure. I mean, in many of the actions that we took in the months before the invasion, almost, I think, inadvertently greenlighted it, pulling our forces out of the Black Sea, listing all the things we weren't going to do. And I think the Biden administration has recovered from that very well. But I think now's the time, Margaret, to lift restrictions on the support that we're giving Ukrainians so they can finish this fight on their terms.
All right. H.R. McMaster, thank you very much for your insight today. We'll be back in a moment. Tomorrow's the first Monday in October, which means a new Supreme Court term, and new Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is now on the job. Chief Legal Correspondent Jan Crawford is here with us. Jan, this is a change. How much of a development is it to have a new justice on this court?
Well, I mean, obviously we have an historic new justice, the first Black female justice on the Supreme Court. She'll take her seat on that bench tomorrow for arguments for the first time. We have 4 women on the court now. That's never happened before either. But what hasn't changed is this is a court that's firmly turned to the right. You've got 6 conservative justices, 3 liberals. It's a court that's willing to rethink decades of progressive rulings. So despite all the historic nature, Justice Jackson really won't change the balance of the Supreme Court at all.
You were here in June, and you left with kind of an ominous statement in talking about potential political earthquakes coming out of Supreme Court decisions, like what we saw out of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. The first key court case is Tuesday. What should we be expecting?
Well, I mean, let me just say right off the top, though, I mean, buckle your seatbelts, because as contentious as last term was, I think this term has the potential to be equally divisive. You're going to have issues on affirmative action, voting rights, LGBTQ discrimination, environmental cases, all of these cases, and they're starting right away on Tuesday with a major voting rights case from Alabama. Challengers are saying that Alabama is diluting the power of Black voters because they're packing most of the state's Black voters into one legislative district. They say there should be 2. Alabama is saying, well, we shouldn't even be considering race in drawing these legislative districts. That would violate the Constitution. If the court agrees with that, that would be a major rethinking of the Voting Rights Act. So this is a big case with significant implications well beyond the state of Alabama.
And
But that's not the only issue this month on race. At the end of the month, we've got that affirmative action case coming out of Harvard and the University of North Carolina that is asking the Supreme Court, a group of white and Asian American students, to say that any consideration of race in admissions, affirmative action in college admissions, violates the Constitution. I expect the court to agree with that decision and end the use of affirmative action. Obviously, quite a controversial decision. Then they have the case involving a Colorado website designer and whether or not she can be forced to design a website for same-sex couples who are getting married, despite her views that that would be wrong, and she says it violates her free speech rights. And then, if that weren't enough, another case on voting rights, and this is all just coming down the pike quickly. Another case that could undermine the role of state courts in deciding and reviewing election procedures. So they'll continue to take more cases, but this is a Supreme Court that is saying we're being asked to decide these cases and we're going to do it, and even if it means our opinions are unpopular.
Well, and we've seen with public polling that there is this perception of a politicized court, and Gallup's numbers, they hadn't seen a drop like this in confidence since they began asking the question.
Right, and we have seen in the past controversial decisions lead to a dip in the court after Bush versus Gore. The court recovered from that. The question is now, is the basic legitimacy being questioned at all? Can they recover?
And this is going to be a huge question. I know the justices themselves have been making public comments. Jan, you're going to be back with us. I can tell you that much. We'll be back with all of you in just a moment. It's been a sad week for us here at CBS News. Our Bill Plante, a remarkable journalist who was part of our family for more than 50 years, died Wednesday at the age of 84. In his legendary career, Bill covered some of the biggest stories for CBS News in and outside of Washington. But for us, Bill was a treasured friend and mentor, particularly to dozens of producers, correspondents, cameramen who worked with him on the White House beat over the 32 years he reported to our tiny little CBS booth down the hall from the briefing room. Bill's smile, his booming broadcaster voice.
Did you make a mistake in sending arms to Tehran, sir?
No.
His sense of humor.
You're never too old to do something stupid!
His never-ending energy and stamina are all among the things that we will miss the most. Bill made us better journalists and better people, and he taught us how to take a step back from the pressure of the news of the day to reflect and pause and embrace the experience. He loved life, and we are all grateful to have known him. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.